Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Anthropology 310 Origins of Human Diversity. It's the 23rd of October. We are on Wednesday of week 10. That's pretty cool. Anytime you get to double digits means you're staring down the end of the semester pretty quick. We're talking about food production and domestication today. We'll talk about some of these early societies right on the kind of cusp of agriculture. And then next time we'll talk about some of the specifics in different parts of the world, what animals and plants were domesticated and how people did that. We got homework number 6, discussion board number 7, and quiz number 8 coming up this week. Discussion board 7, remember we watched a video on Monday about those hunter-gatherers who first walked into the first sedentary village. If you were a hunter-gatherer and one day you found your first band of Natufian villages, which we'll talk about today, that you've ever seen, what are two things that might be mind-blowing for you? Cool. And you also have the stories from the Stone Age. Watch the video on Google Drive and answer these 3 questions, 250 words. Benefit, move to grain gathering, brought changes to hunter and gatherers' lives. What are some benefits and some cost? Start to see the development of religious or spiritual beliefs. What was found at Natruvian burial site and what does that tell us about people of the time? We'll talk about that today. And the Younger Dryas, we'll also talk about today what happened to the environment during this era. And you can not only watch the video if you're a reading kind of person as well. I put this guide up here. It's 20 pages, but a lot of it's pictures and stuff. And you can learn about those issues as well. It's even time-stamped so you can figure out where you are in the video. That's kind of nice. We'll also have a quiz this week. Questions like, talk today about the Natufians. Who were they and what are they famous for? Next time, we'll talk about when people domesticated plants, what are at least 3 traits they selected for, and 2 for animals. As well as at the end of this unit, we'll talk about after people began farming, why is it difficult for them to go back to being hunter-gatherers? We very rarely see it. Why? Okay. The last thing before we get into the lecture for today is there's an extra credit opportunity happening this Saturday at Blackwater Draw. You can come out and participate in our Addle competition. We talked just a week or so ago about Clovis, the Clovis site, and why it was important. There's pictures over there. So this weekend over at the Blackwater Draw, the Clovis type site, we're going to have our annual fall event. This kind of marks the end of the season where we start to cut back hours over there because when it starts getting cold. So we have like a big end of the year festival, and it involves addles, which are what? What are addles? Addle. What is an addle? Addle. A spear thrower, yeah. Addle. Well, I believe it's an indigenous word. I'm not sure where though. Let me do this one. So let me show you real quick. We talked about people of Blackwater Draw. They were throwing these addle spears at people. Here's a little video. Here's a guy. Hopefully he knows what he's doing. Yeah. So you can do that. We'll have hay bales set up with burlap sacks on them, pictures of mammoths and mastodons and bison and all kinds of animals. And so you can practice throwing them and you can win prizes. So that will start at 9 a.m. on Saturday. And then for starting to practice, they'll give a tour at 10. And then the competition will be at 11. You can win fabulous prizes, including your very own addle if you win, or just extra credit if you show up. We'll also have booths there. You can do flint knapping like we did with Dr. Asher. There are going to be fiber arts and bead making and other demonstrations as well, pottery, I think, and some other stuff. So come on out on Saturday and get yourself some extra credit. Okay. So let's jump into it. We talked last time about different food production strategies, right? And up until this week, really, we've been only talking about hunter-gatherers, right? Whether we're talking about Homo erectus or Neanderthals, Denisovans. These are all hunter and gatherer groups, right? No farming involved until we get to kind of a new period called the Neolithic. So we talked about not about the differences in these in size, right? Foraging or hunting gathering groups are generally smaller. They're generally more nomadic. They have less food shortages than farming societies, so they have less risk of famine because they have a more diverse food assemblages. They have minimal trade, not really any specialized jobs beyond hunter and gatherer. And generally, there are very little differences in wealth or political power between people. And we all know that these things are very different in our world today. There's lots of differences between wealth, and there's lots of people with political leadership and some without. We have lots of different kinds of jobs and lots of trades. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about how we go from basically this column to this column. We talked about lots of. We use modern day. We use ethnographic analogy, looking at modern day hunting and gathering groups as a way for us to learn a little bit about the past. Right? We looked at a video of Kung Bushmen in Tanzania and learned about their life, and used that as a way to think about what hunting and gathering might have been like a long time ago. So that kind of sets the baseline for what we'll be doing the rest of the week, talking about this transition. How do people go from being hunter and gatherers to farmers? And for a long time, there was like this idea that it was a really sharp break, that people were like, I'm a hunter and gatherer, and tomorrow I've discovered agriculture, and suddenly I settle down, start farming, build cities and pyramids, and have armies and things like that, right? But what we've learned is that it's through recent, last couple decades through archaeology, is that it was much more complex and kind of nebulous in a lot of different places and didn't always follow the same historical trajectory. Because there are these kind of steps in between, right? Like you can be a hunter-gatherer and be on your way to agriculture by doing certain kind of activities like propagation, right? Oftentimes we see hunter and gatherers. It's not like they just are kind of like a plague of locusts coming through and just taking everything. Oftentimes they'll, they have a good, really deep understanding of their environment and what types of plants and animals are really important. And so they will often work to propagate those. So like if there are fruit trees around, oftentimes you see hunter and gatherers kind of weeding around them or taking out other trees around them, which might crowd out their trees. We also see people kind of, propagating different animal species, and not necessarily like raising and domesticating, but often having these kind of cultural prohibitions about like, don't hunt when the mom deers are with their babies, right? Because that's going to impact the population in the future. This can even be more so active cultivation, right? And this can be even like, I didn't plant this tree or this plant, but I'm going to actually take care of it, right? Like I'm going to come back to this tree every year, or I might even, start to think of it as like my tree or like my group's tree, right? We also see harvesting, right? Often from the same areas and from new resources we'll talk about today with grains. And then storage, right? People, and that kind of entails sedentism or them settling down in one place because it's hard to store things if you are moving around. There's also these kind of environmental conditions that go along with the transition to agriculture, right? We talked last time about Marshall Solomon and his idea of the original affluent society, this idea that hunter and gatherers work less than modern day people, even modern day people like us in America, right? 40-hour work week, we work so hard for this. We're so liberated. But in actuality, hunter and gatherers work about 3 or 4 hours a day and then spend the rest of the time kind of hanging out and doing culture activities, hanging with family, telling stories and myths and doing whatever they do. So archaeologists are kind of interested in what are the conditions which allow or force people to take up agriculture. And a lot of this has to do with kind of growth of populations, especially in areas where conditions are good. Like in the Fertile Crescent, early foragers were there, had lots of food. It was like a pantry or a buffet. And so they started to have more and more children, but then when conditions got bad and they were stuck in one place because they were already sedentary, it was difficult for them to go back to hunting and gathering. So they had to do a more intensive strategy like agriculture. This also has to do with not just population on small scale, but also kind of global climate changes we'll talk about in a little bit. Yeah, and this often has to do with the switch to being sedentary, right? If you're more sedentary, it's easier to have more children. You don't have to carry them around everywhere, and hopefully you have more resources to take care of them. We at the end of the Upper Paleolithic, we see a shift from big game hunting to the use of many different kinds of natural resources at the end of the Upper Paleolithic. This is what we call broad spectrum foraging. Here's my other PowerPoint. Sorry, I lost it. And one of the examples of probably the earliest of these broad spectrum sedentary foragers is a society we call the Natufian Society. This is a good kind of test quiz information. Um, there we go. So this is an archaeological. It's a picture of the archaeological site, one of the Natufian cultures, and they're a great example of one of these first societies, kind of at the very end of the Paleolithic, which starts to both be sedentary and then eventually at the very end of their time makes the kind of first jump to agriculture. So that's why they're a really important society to learn about. They generally live in this area. This is the Mediterranean Sea. This is modern day Israel, into like Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, kind of up into like maybe towards the edge of Turkey right in there. We'll see talk about some other sites, but generally this area, right? This is part of an area which we'll come back to in the next couple lessons called the Fertile Crescent. It's called that because it's shaped like a crescent. Here's the Fertile Crescent, and then here's kind of the Nile right over here. And this is really the earliest places where we see agriculture right in this area. But next week when we talk about the emergence of civilization, civilizations down here in the Mesopotamia region as well as the Nile, right? So important for our story for the next couple of weeks. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. Yeah, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. About 15,000 years ago, we start to see these right in what's called the Epipaleolithic, right at the very end of the Paleolithic, just before we see the introduction of new kind of tools, which would usher in the Neolithic, right? So it's one of these really iconic transitional societies going from what we think of as hunter-gatherer, Paleolithic kind of people, which we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, to agriculture and setting the stage for civilization. It's an interesting case because it was actually excavated by this woman. She was a Dorothy Garrard. She was a British archaeologist, lived from 1892 to 1968. She did excavations in Israel, which at the time was British Palestine, at a cave called Shukba. There's a picture of it right here. If you go on the Bible Walk tour, you can go there and see it. And was one of the first to kind of publicize this as a really early site for early agriculture and early sedentism. Before this, before like the 1940s or so, in this part of the world, there was a lot of archaeology going on, but it was like what we call biblical archaeology, more of the historic era. Like, I'm going to look for King Solomon's tomb, or I'm going to look for the walls of ancient Jerusalem and stuff. And while they did start kind of looking for those historical era artifacts, as they dug down, they started to find these older ruins or older artifacts, which pointed to a much earlier civilization. So yeah, they were working in this cave, and they found prehistoric tools, and it was really the beginning of understanding kind of the transition towards sedentism and agriculture. About 15,000 to about 11,000 years ago. And this was after the last glacial maximum. So, right, this is after the time when, we were talking a couple of weeks ago about, glaciers covering most of the northern hemisphere where people are hunting mammoths at Blackwater Draw. It also was part of the discussion of when people came to the New World, right? Because the ice caps were covering much of North America, and you have to either go by boat or wait for the ice-free corridor. And so this is a society right at the very end, what we call the terminal Pleistocene, the very, very end of the Pleistocene, and the beginning of what's called the Holocene, or the modern post-glacial era. And it coincided with this transition. There's two periods really, which we'll talk about, the kind of the early Natufian, where people start to settle down, live in sedentary villages, what's called sedentism. But they're still doing this kind of broad spectrum hunting and gathering. Basically, This is a time after the glaciers when the world is warming up and there's lots of resources. This is a really rich area for resources. You got things like, wild grasses like wheat and barley and rye. You got chickpeas, you got lentils, you got dates, you got all kinds of stuff that you can eat in terms of plants, but you also got lots of animals. You got gazelles, you got oryx. And so basically, people, there's this little narrow strip of land between the sea and the desert where people start to settle down because there's a lot for them to eat, but there's not a lot of space. Um, and that's kind of during the early Natufian era, about 12,000 to about 10,800 or so BC, or 14,000 to 12,800 years ago. And then kind of the late Natufian, following what's called the Younger Dryas, we'll talk about that in a second, in which they switched from hunting and gathering towards beginning of agriculture. So the beginning period, kind of a wetter, warmer, more diverse plant and animal life. Later period becoming more restricted. It's actually, where's my Younger Dryas slide? Oh, here it is. And scientists think that this transition between the kind of early and the late stage between being, sedentary hunter or gatherer to sedentary farmer was caused by this cold period, right? The glaciers had already retreated at this point for a couple thousand years. People had started to settle down, but then there was this cold snap, which lasted about 1,000 years ago, and kind of a return to some of those earlier glacial conditions. In Northern Europe, you can see there's glaciers and tundra which reappear on the landscape. But in the Near East, in the Fertile Crescent, what it basically causes, and throughout Africa, is more desertification, right? The dry areas become very dry, and there becomes even less space for those people to make their living as hunter and gatherers. It's also been linked to kind of the disappearance of megafauna, maybe in North America. We see the extinction of mammoths and mastodons kind of at the end of the Younger Dryas. So the question is like, what is life like for these people, right? A transition from in the earlier stages being sedentary and foraging for their food to early agriculture. And we can actually see this kind of transition. This is a place called Tel Abu Harera, and it's up here. This is kind of northwest Syria, almost to the Turkish border. And it's an archaeological site where we can find some of the earliest agriculture. And it was actually done through salvage excavation because they were building this dam to make a big lake, and they found some ancient ruins there. One of the interesting things about this is we actually find the people during this time period, it not only changed how they lived, but also changed their bodies, right? Especially we can compare people at kind of the earliest levels of this site to some of the more recent ones. And people at the bottom levels where they were still hunter and gatherers tended to be healthier, tended to be stronger, had a more diverse diet. And in the later agricultural era, which we'll talk more about next week, we start to see like repetitive injuries from like kneeling down and harvesting grass. So injuries on your knees and your feet and on your hands. We also see injuries or wear on their teeth because they are taking wild grasses and eventually farming them and then grinding them down. And we see kind of the evidence of little pieces of stone in their bread, which wears down their teeth. There's a lot of cool stuff that we can find archaeologically at these Natufian sites, which haven't been found at any of the sites like we've talked about previously, right? Previously, we were talking about like Clovis site, and we're finding things like spear points. Over here. We're finding mammoth bones and things like that, really indicative of hunter and gatherer society. What kind of things do you think that we would find as we start to look at civilizations or societies where they start to invent agriculture? Do you think they'll have different kinds of tools? What kind of tools may you need when you become a farmer? Yeah, so we find things like this, right? An early kind of hoe. It's a composite tool. We'll find these like stone blades that are hafted onto pieces of stick. We'll also find digging sticks, like a stick with a kind of a sharp end, either wood or a stone, for poking holes in the ground and planting that way. What else might you need that you don't need as a hunter-gatherer, or at least as a big game hunter? Yeah, baskets. This is what we call pre-pottery Neolithic. So there are no pots here. We do find these. Who said there are no pots? What is that? Not pottery. What's that? Clay? Not clay. It's pre-pottery. Nope. stone. It's very heavy. These are like giant stone bowls, and often we find like mortars and pestles and things like this. So this is what we call the Neolithic, right? It's still in the Stone Age, and it's pre-pottery Neolithic, so they don't have pottery. We'll get to that next week when we do our pottery activity, right? So we find a bunch of stone tools like of different kinds, right? Here is a hoe stick or a hoe. Here is a grinding stones, mortar and pestle for grinding up grains to make flour, make bread. Here's another pestle or maybe a container for putting stuff. And then we find these. These are tiny little stones which have been flaked off. So instead of like a big blade or something, we find these tiny little stones. And then they take either a piece of bone or a piece of wood and take a groove down the middle and stick all those little stones inside to make what are they making? There's a good picture of it. What are they doing with that stuff? Yeah, right. It's like the first sickle. So these are called microliths because they're really tiny. They're not like spear points or anything. It's a little tiny flakes that come off, and you basically put them into a piece of bone or a piece of stick, and then put some sticky substance, tar, or animal fat or something, to keep them in there, and then you use that to harvest grain. So these are all hallmarks of a society that either is agriculture or right on the verge of agricultural revolution. Right, they're harvesting a lot of wild grains, whether they are planting them or not. One of the other cool things about this society is just the material culture in general, right? So not only is that society one of the first to kind of invent agriculture, they're also pushing ahead these other kind of cultural expressions as well. These are over here on the left are two examples of sculptures that we find. The first one is called the Lover's Sculpture, the Anchorect. Over here, you can see kind of the stylized image of two people in an embrace. And then over here is kind of they found this in a grave. What do you think that represents? Second. What's this picture represent? What do you think? Second. Is it just random? Yeah, it's a body, right? You got a head, you got shoulders and arms, a torso. Looks like what my kids draw for people, right? And again, kind of one of these early representations of people, right? And then kind of continuing this earlier tradition of figure making, which we saw at the end of the Paleolithic with Venus figurines, but again, kind of people. This is a more complex kind of figure. We also see interesting things with burial practices. This is a picture. If you go to the museum over in Israel, you can see this is an Natufian grave. And people are often buried with grave goods. And one of the most, and these kind of are really interesting because they come from a good distance away, right? We find people living kind of in the Fertile Crescent who are getting resources from the ocean, like seashells and things, and then also kind of going into the desert and getting things like malachite and other types of stone metals or things that they used to make metals later as kind of grave goods and ornamentation. And this is probably one of the most famous. In a lot of the graves you find, you can see it on this body right here. They're in this fetal position, again, kind of curled up, or the legs and arms just kind of put up and compressed. But the skull, you can see, has this like headdress or a helmet or something like that, or a cap, and it's made out of these straight, pretty long, they're like this long seashells with a hole in the middle, and then they'll string them together to make this kind of headband or this hat. Again, it's kind of an example. There are other examples as well of personal ornamentation. And we don't find this at all of them. So it suggests to people that we're starting to see more social differentiation, right? Versus hunter and gatherers, everyone's pretty much the same. We start to see differences in the kind of stuff that you're buried with, right? And that's thought of as like an indication of who you were in life determines how you get buried. We also see, in addition to plants, we see animals in Natufian society as well. Dogs played an important role. We talked about this 2 weeks ago with the domestication of the dog at the end of the Upper Paleolithic. It was the first animal domesticated, and it was domesticated from wolves. What kind of features were selected for when people were domesticating wolves into dogs? What do you need to, what might you select for that maybe it's not so great in wolves, but you want it in a dog? Or what traits would you want to change a wolf into a dog? Mm-hmm. Yeah, more playful, less biting of you.
More playful, less aggressive.
Yeah, what else? Protective, yeah, right. Protect the camp or protect the home site. Early warning system, also part of your hunting and strategy as well. But dogs aren't just useful for hunting; they're useful around the farm as well, right? Especially if you're starting to be more sedentary, they can keep watch at night. They can keep away predators when you're sleeping and things like that. And dogs played a really big part of early Natufian society, and we can actually see this archaeologically. This is from a site called Ain Mahala, about 12,000 BC or 14,000 years ago. And this is an elderly woman buried here, right in the fetal position, kind of like the other burials we saw. But what's this up here? It's not human bones. It's dog bones. What does that tell us? This is the first ever burial we find in the world with someone buried with a domesticated dog. What does that tell us? Important milestones in human history. Here's my archaeological evidence of the first dog mob. People were really interested in their pets. Like these things had gone from being just kind of wild animals out there to maybe somebody, you let this creature follow you around, to kind of beloved members of the household, so much so that when someone was buried, they got buried with their favorite dog. But that's especially in the early kind of in the Natufian era, we're still limited in terms of domestic animals to dogs. They do interact with a lot of other animals, but at this time they're still doing hunting and gathering primarily, especially with animals. And so they're doing things like hunting gazelles, oryx, which are kind of like wild cows and wild boars. And so doing both of these kind of things, right? And again, indicative, especially on the early period, of a really broad subsistence strategy, where that if you're hunting gazelles and that's all I do, if the gazelles have disease and die off, you're going to be in real trouble. But these Natufians are doing a lot of things. They're harvesting grains, they're hunting, and so they're able to make things work. Yeah, it's this transition that illustrates kind of the shift, especially from being nomadic to sedentary, and then taking that leap to agriculture. Right nearby, so this is kind of the Natufian era right here. Once we get up into Turkey, we see very similar sites up here in kind of the Karacadağ Mountains. And one of the most famous is Göbekli Tepe. We're going to watch a video of it in a few minutes. And this site is just amazing. It was discovered in 1963 in the kind of archaeological survey, but no real excavations were done until 1994, and they've been ongoing pretty much since. This is more recent, like going ahead a little bit in time from the Natufians, right? So we're no longer like 14,000 years, we're like 9,500 years ago. Again, still in this kind of pre-pottery Neolithic. People using these small tools like sickles and things to harvest wild grasses, also using other Neolithic tools like axes and to cut down trees and things like that. But this is a site in northeast Turkey or southwest Turkey. And there's actually this kind of complex of sites. There's probably 6 or 8 of them right around from the same time period, which display similar characteristics. And what's really wild about this is it doesn't seem to be, especially through most of this site until the very end, we find this is just an amazing site, right? For being sedentary hunter and gatherer populations, no evidence of agriculture, at least till the very end of this. Sedentary agricultural populations or hunter and gatherer populations, no real farmland around here. But people are doing something which they've never done before. They're building large settlements, no longer just a couple people or families living around together. People starting to live in bigger and bigger groups and building big stuff. These are examples over here of some of the megaliths. These are like 50-ton block or 40-ton blocks of stones piled up, often in these kind of T-shape, what they're called stela, like statue or stone statue things. And they're amazing. They're giant these statues, and they often have figures drawn onto them or carved into them of different kinds of animals. So, how do you think? Why is this different from what we've seen before? I guess. How is this different from everything else we've seen so far in this class? Have we seen any kind of monumental architecture before? Any pyramids or Stonehenges or Great Walls of China? No, this is the very first time in human history that people are like, let's build a giant stone sculpture for mysterious reasons. Still argued about, right? And so, what do you think you would need to do this? Could a small family group of hunter and gatherers do this? If I'm just like walking around the landscape, like 50 people. What do you think a small group of people who are mobile hunter and gatherers could build something like this? No, not yet. What would you need to do? You probably need a lot of what?
Tools.
Tools and people to work those tools, right? So this is indication of like larger and larger groups of people coming together and building something which no one has ever built before. And archaeologists have struggled with this question. If they're not agriculturalists, they're still hunting and gathering. How do they bring this many people together to build these giant structures, right? You know, multi-ton structures and kind of spread across this region. So we'll show you a video about Göbekli Tekli and kind of the mystery of Göbekli Tekli, especially how they managed to mobilize such a large workforce to build these monuments. So let's take a look. Right. So sites like Göbekli Tekli kind of showcase that transition from hunter and gatherer to sedentism, and then the leap to agriculture. And this is going to kind of be a preview of a lot of the themes we're going to talk about next week, where we see people living settled lives in bigger and bigger communities, right? First in villages and then towns and eventually cities. And we start to see the construction of large scale monumental architecture, right? These 50-ton megaliths. We also get these really interesting, we've seen some sculptures before, like in those Natufian villages or in those Venus figurines, but we're starting to see kind of life-size, naturalistic sculptures. This is the Urfa not Ma. Urfa man about 9,000 years ago. This is about 6 foot tall, kind of a realistic depiction in 3D of an actual person, right? This is, again, kind of revolutionary in human history. So next time we're going to talk, we'll use kind of the video that we saw today as transition. We'll talk about, like you saw in the video, what are some of what's that one trait that made the wild wheat different from the one that became domesticated? What was that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, right, this band of cells. And it just comes down to one single mutation. And we'll start to talk next time about what are some of those traits that early hunter and gatherers or late hunter and gatherers and early farmers were looking for when they were selecting which varieties to propagate and become domesticated staples. So that's it for today. We are out of time. Next time, we're going to take a look at different agricultural traditions, not only in the Near East, but around the world. We'll see how it's different in Mesoamerica, in the Near East, and in China. So come back on Friday for that. Thanks so much for hanging out. See you next time.